Okay, here is the lecture to replace Monday's class period. What we're going to be doing, as you can see on the screen, is we're going to be beginning Unit 1, Part 2, Race Relations in the Post-Reconstruction South, 1877 to 1900. Remember, this is from Chapter 17, the second half, the part on race relations. So if you haven't already done that reading in Chapter 17, go ahead and begin that now. Take a look at your unit study guide, and the page numbers are there, and that'll sort of walk you through what we're going to be doing. I won't be doing the whole lecture on this. What we'll be doing is a one section that we'll pick up when we come back on Wednesday. Okay, so if you look at your unit outline and the lecture notes, the first thing we're going to do is look at what happens at the end of Reconstruction as all of the southern states are redeemed. That is, they become controlled by white Southerners, and particularly white Southerners who are Democratic. So in that context, beginning in the late 1870s, as the states are redeemed, and then if you remember after the election of 1876, when Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, becomes president, and in exchange, the white South gets the federal government to withdraw out of the South and let the South be. So after that time, what we're going to see across all the 11 southern states and the border states, places like Kentucky and Tennessee and Maryland, who didn't ever leave the South but are southern states, we're going to begin to see the idea of white supremacy come to the forefront. So the first thing we're going to look at here is look at white supremacy in Southern culture, politics, and law. So we're going to look again at sort of how white Southerners view themselves in terms of white supremacy. Then we're going to look at politics and law and the creation of a legal framework that will establish white supremacy and really create what we think of when we think of the South in the 20th century, the idea of segregation. Okay, so let's look at culture. And the first piece of that is what I call the Lost Cause Part 2. So remember when we first started our lecture on Reconstruction, I talked to you about that whole idea of recapturing the past, the romanticized past of the South, where, everybody was happy, both whites and African Americans, because they all were in the correct place in terms of white supremacy. In the post-Reconstruction South, the lost cause is going to carry on, and that idea of the romanticized South is going to be carried into this idea that I've given you, which identifies the idea of Southern whites in the post-Reconstruction period, and that is Reconstruction was a failure and redemption saved the South. So the South, Reconstruction was this period when white Southerners were trying to save the South from all those bad people, African Americans out of their proper place, white Northerners coming in to try to change the way of life of the South. All of those things were bad, and white Southerners, the KKK, the Redemption Movement, have saved the South and restored the lost cause. So the lost cause's role isn't really going to go away once white supremacy comes along. It's actually going to now become the national culture of the white South. Okay, the white South is going to hold on to that idea. African Americans and some Northerners are going to have a different idea about that. But right now we're looking at those white Southerners who feel that they have been redeemed. Part of that, of course, is going to play into what we talked about before during Reconstruction, and that is the idea of stereotyping African Americans. We can be supreme over African Americans if we're white Southerners because we're going to identify African Americans as incapable, dependent, violent, if allowed to be unrestrained and not controlled. All of those stereotypes that we talked about before are going to become prevalent and become embedded in the culture of the South and also the culture of the North. And I pull the North in at this point because it's really important to realize that that Northerners, again, they're not we want to believe that the North were the quote good guys, and to some extent they were, but they also had racial prejudice embedded in their own cultures as well. And the stereotyping is going to become a part of how Northerners really excuse themselves from having to make any kind of effort to help African Americans in the South, except for some whites who, look beyond the stereotypes. A place that we're going to explore when I come back to class, but you can go ahead and explore if you want, is a website at Ferris State University in Michigan. And this website is it's a web-based museum, and the museum's title is the Museum of Racist Memorabilia. This museum is really very disturbing because what they've done at Ferris State is they've gathered together culture, the physical remnants of culture from the late 19th century and the early 20th century, things that people were collecting and putting in their homes. Once movies come in the late 19th and early 20th century, movies and cartoons that become, you can go to the movies and see, that are becoming part of what you see all around you in your society. What these items, if you go and you look at the museum, the museum shows you the different stereotypes of African Americans. So you'll see a list of the Jezebel caricature, the Mammy caricature, the Pickaninny caricature, and many, many others. And if you click on those caricatures, you'll see they'll give you photographs of things that people had in their homes, movies that were shown that depict these stereotypes. And so these stereotypes become the way that people excuse not acting on behalf of equality or on behalf of basic humanity for African Americans. Because if I believe that those stereotypes are true, then I believe that these people are not equal to me. So take a look at that. We'll come back to that when we come back to class and kind of talk a little bit about some of those things. But that's a place that you can go and kind of see how much a part of American culture these stereotypes had become, and how that emphasizes the ability of the white South to create their legal framework of white supremacy without a lot of people standing up and saying, hey, what's going on, except for African Americans who are protesting within a context, as we'll see, of, they're kind of like swimming up a stream or trying to climb a ladder with somebody throwing something down. This is going to be a very difficult struggle for African Americans to overcome because of all of the stereotypes and these ideas about the lost cause. So as we go into looking at how white Southerners start to actually push back and create white supremacy, one of the things that we want to pay attention to and remember is what it is that African Americans are going to be fighting against, not just in law, but also in attitude. Okay. So, white supremacy in Southern culture, we've gotten the idea of what the culture part about is. Let's look at and begin to look at the issue of how white supremacy is made legal. Okay, so we'll look at that. I think let me hold here and look at this. Yeah, we've got that right. So we're in number 3, white supremacy made legal. If you look at your outline, that's where we are. Okay. We've already talked about the crop lien system, and how the crop lien system, even during Reconstruction, was created as a way to limit economic opportunity for rural African Americans, particularly those who had been enslaved on plantations. The desire of the white South to maintain that control over their laboring class, and how they did that by keeping African Americans in perpetual debt. Once each state is redeemed and the white South takes over state legislatures, what's going to happen are laws are going to be passed in all of the states of the South. Southern state legislatures will pass laws that will make it even more difficult for African Americans to get out of debt. There's more restrictions on what happens to you if you try to flee a debt. There are more restrictions on if you aren't, quote, under contract, then that means that you can be a vagrant and put in jail. More of those ideas that under Johnson's restoration had been started are now going to be put back into place and actually expanded in order to try to control the labor force, to keep people on the plantations growing cotton for white Southerners and making a profit for them and keeping slaves on the plantation and in debt so they can't get out of it. So that's part of the white supremacy. If I can keep you down economically, then it's going to be really hard for you to find any spare time to try to protest the political limitations that are going to be put on you. If you're just struggling to survive every single day of your life, your ability to spend time engaging in the long process of defending your political rights is going to be very difficult to achieve. So it gets the white Southerners profit, but it also puts a lot of barriers up to climbing that ladder. Okay. So the second thing that the South is going to do is they're going to engage in what we call disfranchisement, or sometimes this is labeled disenfranchisement. Okay, either way you say it is fine, and Jim Crow laws. Disfranchisement means to deny somebody the right to vote. Okay, if you enfranchise somebody in this context, you are giving them or granting them the right to vote. So the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution and the 15th Amendment enfranchised people. Okay, what the white South is going to try to do is figure out ways to disenfranchise or disfranchise African Americans. And they're going to try to do this through laws. So we're looking at how they create a legal framework that makes it so that African Americans legally won't be able to vote, or at least from the white South's view. And so we'll look at poll taxes and we'll look at literacy laws. And then as we start to look at some other things, we'll also look at Jim Crow segregation laws as well. So those things are going to go together. Okay, so what are some of the things that the white South did? What did state legislatures do to try to disfranchise African Americans after Reconstruction? One of the first things that they did was they instituted what are called poll taxes, which are not something that was completely unheard of. This is something that poll taxes are something that were collected by some other states outside of the South. But what is a poll tax? A poll tax is a tax that you pay in order to register to vote. So just like every year, if you own property, you have to pay your property taxes. Now what these laws do is they say, if you want to have the right to vote, you have to be able to put together enough money to pay your poll tax. Okay? Now, poll tax is applied to everybody, but they were set up in such a way that if you were very poor, you wouldn't be able to afford to pay your poll tax. And the people who were the poorest in Southern society were who? I hope you're guessing as I say this. African Americans, particularly rural African Americans, that made up the vast majority of people who were voting. And so poll taxes put a monetary barrier up for you to be able to vote. And given the system of constant indebtedness that most rural African Americans were in because of the crop lien system, you can see that that's going to just sort of basically deny the right to vote to most people because they can't pay the poll tax. You have up here, this is a picture of a poll tax for the year, 1895 in Birmingham, Alabama. And if you note, the total fee is going to be $2, which is, you think, oh yeah, $2, big deal. I could just pull that out of my pocket. But $2 was a lot more back in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. And that also, for a poor African American in debt, was almost impossible to gather up as real, true cash money. Okay, I might have things I could trade, but nobody's looking. If you look at that poll tax receipt, nobody's saying I could trade to do that with a good. I got to have cash, and I don't have cash to do that. So poll taxes were used across the South to disenfranchise African Americans. Okay, so poll taxes are put into place. The second thing that will happen is Southern states will enact literacy laws. What if you are somebody who can come up with the money to pay the poll tax? If you have money to pay the poll tax, then you have a legal right to vote. But if I'm a white Southerner, I don't want you to have the right to vote, right? So, can I pass some legal restrictions that will apply to somebody like you who might have some money and you might be able to pay the poll tax because I want to deny you the right to vote? Well, the solution to that were literacy laws. Literacy laws were laws that required you to, when you went to register to vote, you would go before the registrar and you would be required to demonstrate that you had a certain level of literacy, that is, that you could read at a certain level. Okay. Now, these literacy laws were easily manipulable because you could go up to a registrar and you were African American and you could say, okay, I want to register to vote. Here's my poll tax. I can pay that. Now, let me do the literacy test. And the registrar, the laws were usually created to say, you have to satisfy the registrar as to the level of literacy. And so you can imagine that if you're an African American and you're going before the registrar, are you ever going to be able to demonstrate your literacy adequately for that person? Most likely not. And oftentimes people were given very complicated statements out of the state constitution or out of, a random piece of legislation, and were told to read it and interpret it in a particular way. And if you didn't get it exactly right, bam, no way, you don't get to vote. Whereas, if white boy Billy Joe Bob came up to the registrar would make them read it, and whatever they said, they would be granted the right to vote. So there was a lot of ways of manipulating that, and that avoids any of the problems of, I did that because of race. I just decided that you weren't literate, right? And that's something that white Southerners believe they could do legally. Okay, so those are two ways that laws were passed in southern states in order to disfranchise African Americans. Now, one of the other things that southern states did that would guarantee the white vote to a white Southerner who was poor, or to a white Southerner who was illiterate, completely illiterate, so that you really couldn't grant them literacy, was the emplacement, and forgive me, I didn't write this down on the PowerPoint, of something called grandfather laws. Grandfather laws, or grandfather clauses. And you spell that CLAUSES. Grandfather clauses that would be added to the poll tax or added to the literacy law that would say something like this: if your grandfather was able to vote, then you don't have to do these stipulations. So grandfather clauses were ways of saying, if your grandfather was able to vote, that means it doesn't matter, you can vote no matter what. Okay? Well, of course, particularly in these early years, no free African American had grandfathers who were allowed to vote in those states. All of their grandfathers were either slaves or free black men living in the South who didn't have the right to vote. So what this does is it just kind of grants to white Southerners a blanket right to vote and allows the law then to really be much more vigorously applied to African Americans. So grandfather clauses were a way to kind of get around any loopholes in these laws that would deny a white man the right to vote. Okay, so poll taxes, literacy laws, and grandfather clauses were big parts of what the South was trying to do. Okay, so if you remember back during Reconstruction, African Americans and their white allies were very determined to make sure that African Americans had the right to vote. And if you recall specifically, the 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution were designed to try to make sure, if you remember in lecture I said, a law can be changed really easily in Congress. Congress can change the law. They can decide that, we're going to change that, repeal it, overturn it, whatever. But a constitutional amendment is much more difficult to change. It's going to stay on the books unless the Congress and 3/4 of the states decide to repeal it or change it. And that's going to be hard to do, even with constitutional amendments that might not be so popular anymore. So you would think, wait a minute, here are these constitutional amendments. Shouldn't those amendments stop these rights? What, shouldn't they stop poll taxes because they're unfairly applied to African Americans? Shouldn't those stop literacy laws? Well, African Americans believed so, as did many of their white allies during this period. And so what they're going to do is they're going to try to challenge these state laws through the process of the court system. And many times what they'll try to do is use either the 14th or the 15th Amendment to say, hey, you can't have a poll tax, or you can't have these rules that say I can't vote. Look, these amendments say I have these rights. The problem will be, as we'll see, and I'll show you this on the next slide, the problem with this is going to be that the Supreme Court itself isn't necessarily going to be willing to look at the 14th and 15th Amendments the same way that African Americans might. Their tendency in these cases during the late 19th century is to be much more willing to acquiesce or give in to white southern states with what they want to do, instead of being expansive about what the 14th and 15th Amendments can do. Yes, they can protect the rights of African Americans. What the Supreme Court is going to do, the Supreme Court's going to make a limited view of the 14th and 15th Amendments. They're going to limit the ability of those to protect African Americans and allow white southern states to act on their own. So the Supreme Court, which many African Americans viewed as part of the federal government and something that might be protective, actually in some ways, in many ways, is going to betray the meaning of both of those amendments by limiting the scope or limiting the ability of those amendments to protect African Americans. So as we go through the next slide, I'm going to talk with you guys about some Supreme Court decisions. It might be a little dry, sorry, but pay attention, write things down. What you want to focus on this section is, again, how does the Supreme Court limit the power of the 14th and 15th Amendment to give the white South more flexibility and limit the ability of African Americans to act on their own behalf to stop these things. Okay, so that's what you want to do. What are limitations that are being made on the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment? Okay, so let's look at the next stage of white supremacy made legal, and that is we'll be going through and I'll be looking at some Supreme Court decisions, and we'll be looking at 4 sets. So we'll do 2 on this slide, and then we'll do 2 on the next slide and look at all of those and kind of talk about what each of those is going to do. The big takeaway line that you want, I may talk in more detail about each of the cases, but the takeaway line you want to get down for sure is what is the amendment that's in question, and then what is it that is happening to restrict the rights of African Americans and expand the rights of white southern states or southern state legislatures. Okay, so the first one is U.S. v. Reese, which actually takes place before Reconstruction is even over. But it indicates to us a little bit about where the court sits with regard to these issues. U.S. v. Reese, 1876, is a limiting of the 15th Amendment. And if you remember, the 15th Amendment was the amendment that said you can't be denied the right to vote based on race, color, creed, or previous condition of servitude. If you remember that from our notes last time. So you can't be denied the right to vote based on those things. And what the folks writing that amendment meant, essentially by saying that, was saying African American men should vote. That was the purpose of that. So it was basically trying to say, you guys can't deny us the right to vote because we're African Americans. Okay? So I'm going to show you some quotes out of the majority opinion of the Supreme Court. So I'll just read this. The 15th Amendment, quote, does not confer the right of suffrage upon anyone, okay, but, quote, prevents the states or the United States, however, from giving preference to one citizen of the United States over another on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So what does that mean? Well, essentially what it says is that this doesn't give you the right to vote if you're a man. What it says is if you, a state, are going to deny somebody the right to vote, you just can't do it on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, or creed, which isn't in there. You just can't do that. But if you have other ways to restrict somebody's voting rights, the 15th Amendment doesn't talk about that. So therefore, what are the effects on voting? What the court does is it upholds limitations on voting that don't directly relate to race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So what does that mean? Think about what we just talked about. What are limitations that the states have placed on voting that are legal under this narrow definition of the 15th Amendment? And if you thought of and guessed poll taxes and literacy laws, you're right. Even though these poll taxes and literacy laws clearly in their purpose were designed to restrict the right of African Americans and were applied based on race, the laws themselves don't say anything about race, color, creed, previous condition of servitude. So therefore, according to the Supreme Court, that limiting of the 15th Amendment means poll taxes and literacy laws are okay. Those are restrictions that southern states can do. Okay? So by the Supreme Court saying, well, you guys laid that out that way, and really maybe you thought you meant to grant everybody the right to vote and equality. You didn't write it that way, so therefore we find a way to limit that, to limit the ability, and to give and grant states broader ability to determine who will vote within their states. Okay, so that was the first decision, U.S. v. Reese, limiting the 15th Amendment and allowing essentially, as poll taxes and literacy laws are put into place and other kinds of restrictions, that those will be allowed. Okay, the second case that we'll look at is U.S. v. Cruikshank, also 1876. And this is the first case that we look at that limits the 14th Amendment. So U.S. v. Reese limits the 15th Amendment. U.S. v. Cruikshank limits the 14th Amendment. In this case, what the courts did was they looked at the 14th Amendment and said this: the 14th Amendment prohibits a state from depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. But this adds nothing to the rights of one citizen as against another. So if one citizen wants to deny you due process of law or wants to do something to restrict your ability to operate, then it isn't up to the Supreme Court or the federal government to disallow or to try to stop what citizens do against each other. Well, what does that mean? Well, what the effect of that was that it allowed for, and I put disfranchisement because essentially the second piece is there. It said that there could be no federal protection from organizations like the KKK, which are not a state agency, which are not the federal government, which are citizens operating against citizens. Okay. Now, if a member of the KKK murders somebody and you have murder statutes, then supposedly you can't murder somebody, right? Because murder statutes say you can't murder somebody. If you're convicted, you're going to go to jail, right? But the KKK can operate, or Southern organizations can operate to try to restrict people's ability to act, right? And nobody's going to do anything. You cannot go to the federal government and say, my 14th Amendment rights of due process are being denied. So you can't go to the federal government to deal with things like that. This is the proper area of the states. Okay, so Cruikshank sort of starts that process. And this one's a little bit harder one to get at. The next one will and actually a lot of people were going, huh, what does this mean? Please clarify. We don't get what you're talking about completely with the 14th Amendment. You've made it a little muddy. In years after, there will be some Supreme Court decisions that will clarify it. And the one that will, set of cases that will clarify it the most are the civil rights cases of 1883, which are considered as confirmation of the Cruikshank decision. Okay, so the civil rights cases, there were a set of 5 cases. I'm not going to hold you to those 5 cases, just say the civil rights cases, 1883. This also, if you want to put that right next to 1883, you can write limits 14th Amendment. Okay, so you have that there for each A, B, and C. Okay, it confirms the Cruikshank decision. Say that 5 times. And what does the court do? It says the 14th Amendment applies only to states, not to private companies or to individuals. Okay, so what that means is if a private company wants to discriminate against you, if they want to say, hey, you're black, I'm not going to hire you. Hey, you're a woman, I'm not going to hire you. Hey, I don't like you, I'm not going to hire you. Then nobody can do anything about that. Okay? And so what it does is it puts into place the legal right of organizations, individuals, companies, anything that's a private entity. It allows you to discriminate freely. So, for example, if I am a department store and I decide that if you're African American, you can come into my store and shop, but I'm not going to serve you at my lunch counter, I can do that because I have a right to decide what I do. Okay, so what it does is it kind of gives a lot of power culturally within the society to allow for segregation, to allow for limitations on the ability of African Americans to operate freely within the South. Okay, the next case that we have is the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which, you know, the first ones that I've looked at here are ones that we want to take a look at. But the one that we really, really, really want to remember, if you don't remember any of the other ones, Plessy versus Ferguson is the one that we want to try to remember. Plessy versus Ferguson was the case that came before the court in 1896 that will most effectively limit the ability of African Americans to have equality within Southern society. If the cases that we looked at on the last page looked at voting and political rights, really what Plessy versus Ferguson is going to do is to put into place a culture of segregation in the South. Okay, a culture of segregation in the South. One of the things that went alongside poll taxes and literacy laws in the South was the creation of what are called Jim Crow laws, which I mentioned before a couple slides back. Jim Crow laws were laws that were, they get this particular name, but these are laws that were designed to segregate people in public places. And we talked a little bit about this in class, I think, but let me reiterate this. What states began to do, in addition to denying political rights, was they began an aggressive process across the South of isolating whites from blacks in public areas. So, in parks, at lunch counters, in public transportation, in public schools, anywhere that in both state and local run government and also in private business. So, doctors' offices, department stores, restaurants, government institutions, public transportation, any of these places where in public whites and blacks came into contact with each other, what the White South did was said, nope, 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 we're not going to intermingle in these places. Whites have their place, blacks have their place. Okay? Now, the reality of all of these institutions that were created was to design a public space and an idea of white supremacy. Because what went along with the ideas of segregation were also much more informal cultural ways of doing things that embedded the idea of white supremacy. So, for example, it was a law that if you got on public transportation, a streetcar, say, that there was a place for coloreds or Negroes, and there was a place for whites to sit. And those were separated from each other. And often they were separated from each other by a board or a wall that said, this is a section for coloreds and this is a section for whites. Or if you were on a train, one car was for coloreds and one car was for whites. And that would be established. But in addition to that, what the White South did was they used that idea to institute other cultural ways of doing things. And let me just give you an example to give you a sense of how African Americans were compelled to behave as though they were inferior and separate, as well as to see that legally before them everywhere they went. One of the sort of, not, it's not in law, but this is how you behave, was this idea that if you were walking along the sidewalk in town and an African American and a white person, let's say two men, are facing each other, they're walking towards each other, it was required by the culture of the South that the African Americans step off the sidewalk, put their head down, and don't meet the eye of the white man, and the white man walks by, and the African American gets back on the sidewalk and continues walking. There were absolute restrictions on how particularly African American men dealt with white women. If you talked to a white woman, that could get you into huge trouble. If you behaved in a way that was perceived as at all aggressive, meeting the eye of somebody, that could get you in trouble as well. So what's being created up until 1876 with Plessy versus Ferguson is both a legal framework of segregation, but added to that segregation was also the very clear idea of white supremacy in this relationship. And if the cultural ways of doing things didn't make it clear to you as an African American where you sat, you could look around you and see how the government and private business viewed you. Because if you looked at two schools, a colored school and a white school, you would see very obviously that the white school gets the money and the black school does not. In a black school, you don't get books. You have benches and not desks. You have one-room schoolhouses, not a big facility. Once electricity comes along, you don't get electricity, but the white school does. And that's true with all of the institutions that are segregated. Okay, so that's the context in which the Plessy versus Ferguson case comes before the court. Poll taxes, literacy laws, the culture of white supremacy, the Jim Crow laws that are segregation laws. And what happens with the Plessy versus Ferguson case, and I kind of showed you two pictures here. The person that is pictured here is a man named Homer Plessy, who was an African American. Okay, he actually was 7/8 white. Only 1/8 of his ancestry was African American, but in the South, that was enough to identify you as African American, as Negro, and colored, and therefore subject to the laws of segregation. Homer Plessy, in this case, attempted to get on the railroad owned by E.S. Ferguson, and that's what you have on the other side is a picture of an advertisement for the East Louisiana Railroad Company. And when he did so, he went and tried to sit in the white section. He was denied that right, and with that, he sued. And what he said was, segregation laws are unfair. They deny me equal protection under the law, under the 14th Amendment. You can't do this. And so what he's trying to do is he's trying to say segregation laws are unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment that allows for equal protection of the laws. Okay, so that was the idea behind it. Homer Plessy didn't do this all on his own. Organizations already, African Americans in both the North and the South, were determined to try to fight against many of these laws. And the Plessy case was in some ways what we call a test case, where they wanted to try to see if they had the ability to get the Supreme Court to overturn these laws, to support the 14th Amendment, a broad decision again of the 14th Amendment. Okay, so Plessy versus Ferguson, they're going to court, they're trying to overturn segregation laws. What happens? Well, the Supreme Court, you kind of can figure out, looking at the cases before, probably are not going to go for the Plessy argument that it denies him equal protection of the law. And if you guess that, you're right. The decision in the case was that the Plessy versus Ferguson case, what the court did was it created what's called the doctrine of separate but equal. Okay, now what does the doctrine of separate but equal mean? Well, what they meant was the very act of having people in separate places. If the culture of the society believes that people should be separate from each other, that does not by itself constitute a violation of equal protection, so long as everything is equal. So if you had two public schools, you could separate people by race, but you had to make sure that each was equal. And so that was the idea that the court said, that separate by itself is not a violation of your equal protection rights, so long as all of these facilities are equal. What makes this decision, from looking back at it, and really from anybody who's looked at the institutions of the South, it's really rather silly, because we really already know that there was no equality. That was the point. Okay, but the majority opinion, and I'll read this to you. Justice Brown wrote the majority opinion, and he declared in sort of the famous line, we consider, quote, we consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument, that is Mr. Homer's argument, to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. Okay, so he's saying right there that the plaintiff's arguing that just because we're separate that's a fallacy. That's wrong, right? He's assuming something that's not true. And then he goes on and says, if this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the law or the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. So the court doesn't look at the facilities, right? They're looking at, and they're just saying, look, these folks want to believe that separate is unequal, but they're wrong. The reality is the act doesn't say anything about white supremacy. Therefore, there is no white supremacy in it. Okay? Even though a logical person can look at that and say, Jesus, this was all about white supremacy. But the court's not going to look at that, right? They're going to be very narrow in their scope and determine that separate but equal makes Jim Crow, makes segregation okay. But not all of the Supreme Court justices agreed. Justice John Marshall Harlan said this in his dissenting opinion, the opinion that opposed it. The majority went with separate but equal, but Harlan writes a dissenting opinion, and he says, he argued that while the law may appear to treat blacks and whites equally, quote, everyone knows that the statute in question had its origin in the purpose not so much to exclude white persons from railroad cars occupied by blacks, as to exclude colored people from coaches occupied by or assigned to white persons. So what he does is he says, come on, you guys, you all know what the purpose of the law was. The purpose of the law was to allow whites not to have to interact with African Americans. This was not about separate but equal. This was about white supremacy. Okay? But Harlan's opinion is a minority opinion. Okay? Harlan's opinion is not the opinion of the court. The court is going to uphold the doctrine of separate but equal, which will be the law of the land from 1896 until 1954, which means through that time, all segregation laws anywhere in the United States are okay. Right? And this allows the South to institute and control segregation laws. It also allows for the ability of other states to engage in segregation. Out here in California, segregation laws were put into place not necessarily against African Americans, but against Latinos and also against Asians. And we'll talk about this more when we get into the 19 teens and 1920s. So this isn't necessarily only done by the South, it's primarily done by the South, but this opens the door for other kinds of racial segregation beyond just African Americans, done in areas like California, the Southwest. There were also some segregation laws passed in Kansas where African Americans were living around the area of Kansas City. And so those kinds of things were put into place. Okay. So those are the legal frameworks that essentially, through court decisions and so forth, white Southern legislatures are allowed enormous flexibility to institute white supremacy in the South and economically and politically push down on African Americans and force African Americans to struggle even more to try to achieve any kinds of gains. And often they were, found themselves in bad situations, like Homer Plessy and the Plessy versus Ferguson case. Okay, so the last thing we're going to look at today in this lecture is we are going to, and this is actually going to be something I'm going to have you guys do. So I'll just pop up the whole slide, and then I'll explain what I'm going to have you do. What we're going to do, starting with what the assignment I'm giving you, and then what we'll do when we come back on Wednesday, is we're going to look at what's called extra legal white supremacy. And what I mean by extra legal is this: I mean outside the law. Okay, these may be things that the law, it's not on the books, but legal institutions are going to ignore in the South. And one of the big things that we identify is as extra legal white supremacy are lynchings. And let me give you a definition of lynchings, and then I'm going to tell you what the assignment is. A lynching is the killing of somebody, okay? It's not just, that is in some way sanctioned by the community. The killing of somebody that is sanctioned by the community, okay? It's not a murder. It's not one person gets mad at another one and they shoot them. And that is a murder. And that's something that everybody's going to be outraged by, and they're going to take that person and they're going to put them into court, and if they're guilty, convict them. But what a lynching is the killing of somebody in that the community has identified, usually wrongly, as having committed a crime or done something that violates the traditions of the community, and they take that person and they kill them. Okay? Often, a lynching will take place after somebody has been accused of a crime. They might be put into jail, and then often they'll be taken out of the jail with not the help necessarily of the law, of the marshal or the policeman, but with the policeman not trying to protect them. So the policeman might turn his back, so to speak, while the mob comes in and takes the person out of jail, takes them off and hangs them, shoots them, kills them in whatever way. So a lynching is something that is done outside the law, but what makes a lynching different from a murder is that usually a lynching is sanctioned by a portion of the community, and the community engages in this activity. Okay, so what I'm going to have you do, because we'll talk about lynchings in the South when we come back, and then look at a short video, and then talk about some other issues of white supremacy. But what I want you to do in preparation for class on Wednesday, in addition to getting your notes together, what I want you to do is I want you to look at this website. This is a website from the Tuskegee Institute, which began collecting data on lynchings beginning in 1882. This does not mean that lynchings didn't happen before 1882. It's just that we don't have really good statistics before that to give us numbers that we can say, yes, we know in 1880 this is how many people were lynched. Okay, so we're using those specific data that Tuskegee collected. The dates go from 82 to 68. But as I noted here, if you look on the screen, most of the lynchings recorded were from 82 to 1940. So that's the period where the vast majority of these lynchings come from. Okay, so given that, and I want you to note that time period, I want you to look at the statistics. And what it does is it lists the states and it lists who was lynched. Okay, so I want you to go through that list, and I want you to answer these questions. Where did lynchings take place most often? So which are the 3 states where it happened most often? And then the question to go along with that, why do you think lynchings were taking place, given how well the white South seems to be achieving their goals of white supremacy legally? I mean, they've got poll taxes, literacy laws, the Supreme Court's on their side. Why are they engaging in violence against African Americans? What might be going on that we haven't talked about yet? Or maybe if you've read in chapter 17, you might have a few hints. What might be going on that seems to indicate that the white South needs to engage in violent acts against African Americans? So answer those 2 questions. I'll give you another one verbally, just as a bonus, and answer this question. As you look at that, what states most surprised you that there were lynchings, and why do you think there were some there? And that's just a bonus, and it's kind of an interesting thing as you look at those statistics, because all lynchings did not take place in the South, as you'll see with those statistics. Okay, so that's it. That's the end of the lecture. Like I said, when we come back on Wednesday, we'll pick up with this assignment. We'll finish off extralegal white supremacy, and then we'll finish race relations in the South by looking at how African Americans respond to this situation, what kinds of organizations they develop, and so forth to try to deal with that. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday.